have one quick design topic, and that will be where we'll wrap things up for this episode. And I want to talk a little bit more about a good UI design. So last night I played a game that Has Been Heroes. This was on our Saturday Night Grab Bag, and the game just did not work for me. This is one of the few times I just had to stop playing the game because I didn't want to play it anymore. And part of that was due to the UI itself. And as a very interesting moment of serendipity, somebody was posting on Twitter about how they feel like you shouldn't complain about like a UI. That, you know, like everyone does the best they can with UI, and that you should just like understand. But I think for me, like, I don't find that being a valid excuse anymore. So many games being released, and I want to talk very quickly about why you need to focus, why UI design should be one of the first and foremost elements of your game. And I'm sure, like for you, Rob, you've played your fair share of indie games, and just the sheer magnitude of titles that just have a very hard time with the UI. And I guess for you, like, when you think about good UI, like, do you think that should be like number one or number two on the list when you start making a game?
I like that those are your options. Number one or number two,
Yeah.
maybe. It's certainly got to be high up there. I mean, certainly you need a game concept. I feel like that is number one. You should probably have a game before you make one. But like in terms of like any amount of polish, like if you're going to polish your game at all, yeah, UI should be top of your list. Like you cannot have someone play a game without there being UI, without there being interactive elements, and to make those accessible is important. You can't, especially in modern times, when you have it's like building a website, right? Yeah. You can build a terrible website these days, and it's inexcusable because there's so many templates, there's so many examples out there of stuff that works. I am willing to bet that 99.9% of the time you're not making a game that requires unique user interface. So, and if you're a programmer and you know how to program that stuff, just copy someone else's UI. Like you don't need to put a ton of time into it, but you need to recognize that it's important. So just copy someone else's. If you don't want to put time into building your own UI, copy someone else. Make sure that it's understandable. Like the start, all the buttons do things that the buttons should do. Like on an Xbox controller, B for back, you know, circle for back. Or if you're on the Switch, then for some reason they swap the two buttons. That confuses the heck out of me. But like, you know, stick with conventions unless you're specifically making UI that is custom for your game and it has to be different. Then you're still putting thought into UI, you know, like you're making choices and judgments about it. And that's really the minimal thing you should be doing, is having an opinion on what UI should be and taking that opinion and implementing it with purpose. You don't just shrug and say, well, if the person can get into game and they bought my game, well, then they should be willing to learn it. Like that's inexcusable, I think. So anytime you've given up on a game because its UI is bad, yeah, I agree with Lunar. Basically, and Mike, absolutely. Both of your guys' statements are 100% true. It is boring, but it is necessary. So there you go.
Yeah, and like here's a really, like what you just said there, Rob, was a really good point. That there are so many games being released these days that when it comes to UI for a lot of titles is not this, you know, magical element that you must, you know, forge, you know, in the sacred flames of Mount Doom or Mount Olympus to get it finished. And if somebody has done something similar and that people understand, you know, it makes no sense to try. Again, we've said this before. This is one area where you don't want to think outside the box on. Like for instance, like a first-person shooter, the right trigger is your shoot button. You know, being edgy and hip, making, you know, up on the D-pad be fire is not going to help anybody. And
right. It's like with ARPGs, you know, health is red, mana is blue. And Diablo has the jars that shrink down over time.
Yeah.
Everyone's adopted that now. So I mean, certainly you could change it up, but you're fighting up. You're going up the stream. You know, you're you're fighting the current. You're not helping anybody.
Yeah, like it makes sense to have an RPG where yellow is health, green is no yellow's health, red is mana, and right click confirms everything instead of left click.
Yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. I asked this on the stream last night about Has-Been Heroes, and apparently it's been ported to every platform except mobile, despite the fact that it feels like it has a very mobile-centric UI. A lot of mouse moving and gestures instead of having keyboard shortcuts and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that drives me crazy, and we see this a lot with games that feel to have a mobile-centric UI when it's not built for mobile, or it's not on a mobile platform. I guess for you, like, what kind of UI elements do you think, or like, particularly bother you if you see them in the game?
I would say anything like you mentioned, anything that defies convention, and you don't have to be conventional. I know most indie developers are against convention, and that's what makes them both great and terrible at the same time. You got a lot of innovation there, but you got to find out you got to look at your game and what it is, and know what your purpose is. If your purpose is to mess with people's mess with the paradigm and shift all that stuff, well then great, you can have a strange UI or non-conventional one. But like, if I'm playing a game and it is like it's an ARPG, and I know what that is, or it's an RPG, I know what that is. Like, I know, having like in the 90s playing RPGs, heck even the 80s, like you press pause and you have all your options there. You can equip, you can do all this stuff. If suddenly you're changing that, like I have to equip on the fly using the mouse wheel or something like that, or when you're switching weapons in an RPG, if it's no longer key press and it's like mouse wheel, then you've kind of messed with me a little bit, and I have to go relearn stuff. And I consider myself very good at intuiting user interface, whether it be a game or software in general. But when someone flips the script on me a lot, then it distracts from my enjoyment of the game and forces me to learn something new that I didn't sign up for. And that's what would make me mad, is if someone decided to go against convention so much that I have to take my enjoyment out of gameplay and put it into learning UI. That would turn me. That's a big turnoff.
And of course, there's plenty of games that are just UI. I mean, hell, we could describe like the whole clicker genre as just that as well. But yeah, like you said, Rob, that like for me, if I have to fight the UI, like if I know what to do in this game, but the UI is getting in my way, whether it's because the mouse clicks aren't working, or I have to do some kind of crazy button combination to do something, it's going to take me right out of the experience. First person clicker, yep. Like, again, with like Has-Been Heroes, like I'll give you the example. You're supposed to move you're on like 3 different lanes. You're supposed to move your heroes around each lane to attack the enemies. But you can only move a hero after one of them has done an attack. But the whole point of the gameplay loop is that you're supposed to match, the hero's attack to the right enemy coming down the lane. And you're basically forcing the player to do the wrong action whenever they're fighting an enemy, and that just drives me crazy. Like, I know what to do, but the game is refusing to let me do it.
Yeah, it is. It's a pain, and menu structure as well, and HUDs or HUDs are also super important. Flipping a control is a big deal to me as well, and that does increase the learning curve. I do have to say that one of my favorite games of all time is like the biggest, most egregiously offensive UI of all time, and that's Dwarf Fortress. And that is one of those games where the UI can be excruciating and painful to learn. I felt like the game had such a strong learning curve and was so unique it was worth it, but I know that would not necessarily be the case for someone who just wants to play a good sim game. That you hear all kinds of great things about Dwarf Fortress, and then you sit down to play it, and I can imagine someone just being like, what the heck, throwing it away as far as possible.
And going to Mike's point, I think that's another really interesting one. That I do think a lot of people don't understand what UI mean. Because when we talk about UI, we're not talking just about on-screen elements. We're talking about, again, gamepad layouts, control schemes, and even stuff like accessibility options, like colorblind mode, subtitles, stuff like that. And it's, I think, another area where a lot of developers tend to gloss over. But you really can't gloss over on a good UI. Because, like I said, with Dwarf Fortress, there are plenty of people who have looked past those issues when it comes to that game. But I'm sure there are plenty of more people who would love to get into that game, and they are not going to touch it, because just trying to get into that game is going to be just a massive undertaking.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, the menus unto themselves switch controls between menus, and that is frustrating. Like some menus, you use the up and down arrows to go up and down, and some that doesn't work. You have to use like W or S or whatever the other buttons are. It's been so long. Yeah, okay. I mean, that is a good point, Mike. I feel like we are being very oh yeah, Lunar. I'm not aware of what Nintendo does there. That is one of those things that, like, I only know a little bit about, and I know it was a big deal in the indie scene to make sure colorblind mode was always there. And it's the same way in board games. Board games is a big, like, make sure it's colorblind friendly. It does seem to be one of those things that I could assume game developers just do nowadays, but that's ignorant of me to think.
Yeah. And yeah, there's like talking about like disabilities, that's its own topic as well, because there's still a lot of companies who don't look at those options. Yeah, but like when it comes to UI design in general, I think it's one of those very weird things, and my voice is starting to go again. But as I was saying, it's one of those very weird things where you see so many developers try to think outside the box when it comes to it, but in many cases, you can just use a standard UI. And I'm trying to think of some other really great examples of this. Like, again, like as you said, like RPGs are another really big example. So many different menus, strategy games as well. That I think this also goes hand in hand with being able to play test your game. Because a new person is going to immediately tell you whether or not they find your UI easy to follow.
Yeah, and that new person may not even be telling you, they just will stop playing immediately and never come back. Yeah, I'm also looking at a few. I think that yeah, there are a few that I'm trying to go back in time here, and I know Roller Coaster Tycoon World had some pretty bad everything, including UI, and that it does for a game as complex and as a Planet Coaster, as any complicated sim game, which I do deal with a lot. Actually, that's a really good genre to look at, because there are some sims and they're very complex just by themselves. Some, as we spoke about before, are purely menu driven, like Out of the Baseball, which I do play on occasion because it's a ridiculously powerful simulator. It's just 100% menus. But you get into some of these, like I think some of the space civilization, like Galactic Civilization or whatever. The UI for those is such a spaghetti, like piece of, like, just a mound of tangled mess. It's hard to get into, but again, those games are so deep that unless you're a fan, you're probably not going to be enjoying it anyway. But yeah, sim games have a tough time with it, and conventions are tough to come by in games that are in such a niche market that, and I kind of point back to the Telltale adventure games, that, you know, your audience is limited and will not expand much regardless of what improvements you make. But that's not an excuse to have bad UI. It's just, you know, maybe some games just ignore it because that's how it's always been. I feel like the innovation part of UI is making it accessible and not trying to rock the boat. You know, you're just trying to keep it afloat and upright and make sure that the player does not have to worry about the stability of that boat. To kill the analogy.
Yeah. But I think one area that is very interesting when it comes to UI design is that what happens when you are making an experimental game, or or if you're making something that is thank you, Mojo. If you're making something that is different from the norm, like to give you an example, like something like Renowned Explorers from Abbey Games, which is its own unique take on SRPG and roguelike design. Like when you are pushing things in a unique direction when it comes to the gameplay, it's very hard, I feel, for the UI to catch up, because as we said, there are a lot of standard UI elements. We can talk about health bars, we can talk about how the camera is supposed to show things in a platformer. But when you're doing something unique or different, like, it becomes a lot harder, I think, for people to figure out how this UI works. But I think, again, you kind of lose that excuse, because playtesting, I think, this is when playtesting comes into play, no pun intended.
Yeah, absolutely. And while speaking from someone who was a tester, a game tester in their former life, it is tough to get developers to listen to those kind of complaints. Most of the time, developers are just trying to get a game out, and they just want to know what's broken so they can fix it and meet the deadlines. And so when some irritating person like me comes along and says, "Hey, this UI feels not very fluid," you're mostly going to get someone just ignoring your issue and moving on to something more pressing. Design suggestions from QA aren't usually taken very well. That don't get me wrong, developers listen to QA all the time, and it is, I do not want to undercut that, because they totally do, but it does, that kind of thing doesn't always go well. So while QA will notice it and say something, and even developers will probably notice it and think that it needs to be improved, it doesn't happen, because it is such a it's like sound. It's so secondary to the goal of a game developer that it often gets overlooked.
Yep. And what happens when you find some kind of issue and it's the 11th hour? I know when I spoke with Bill Garner when he worked on the original BioShock, he talked about how they had a completely different UI for BioShock, that they decided to change things over, and then they couldn't change it back without breaking other elements in the game. So while that UI wasn't the most optimal, it was what was kind of there at the time to wrap up the game. And I hate to say it, but those kinds of excuses I don't think hold much water today, with just so many games being released. That you can't purposely or willingly leave in annoying aspects and expect the consumer to just, grit their teeth and bear with it. Because again, like as we said earlier, like, you bought 20 different games or 20 plus games on Steam so far. Like, if a game annoys you, you can return it, or you can just immediately go on to your next title. Like, there's no reason these days to, I think, suffer through a bad game to get to that mythical, the game opens up or the game begins point.
Yeah, I feel like there's the exception that always comes up for me, and that is No Man's Sky. They got away with so much for so long, and I don't know if UI is ever a problem. But I do feel like there's so many. The fact that you can fix it after launch is such a crutch that you don't realize that you have to be successful enough to get past that first launch. That a bad UI can keep people from playing your game and give you bad reviews, and if you are waiting to fix it until afterwards, if you're No Man's Sky, you had the funding ahead of time, per our point many years ago here, but like you might not be able to sustain it. So just make sure it's playable, make sure it's in there, make sure it's something that people can navigate and access your awesome game with, or else you've wasted a lot of effort.
Yeah, Ben, I think one thing, as you said, with like day one patches or post-release support, UI design is not something you save for post-release support. That is a huge no-no when it comes to game development. And like as we've said, like when you trying to get this game out there, first impressions really do matter. And like it goes back to our previous section when we talked about Fallout 76. Fallout 76 could become an amazing game in 2 to 3 years, like No Man's Sky. But how many people are going to be willing to give Bethesda, the credit to do that over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, it's a weird business sometimes. But yeah, I would like to see, games get way better over time instead of they get launched and they're average. And but no one has the money realistically to keep that up. And Bethesda, they're already on other projects. They're not going to add 2 more years to the development of a game that's already launched.
And it hasn't already done well to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Like No Man's Sky, I think it may turn into the exception to this rule, I think.
Oh, it was already the exception. I was shocked it lasted as long as it did to get better. Like given the reviews, I don't know how it survived at all. But hey, it's thriving and good for them, you know.
Yeah. And like we say this a lot, like it goes back to my game presentation. Now a lot of people will only look at the winners in terms of they'll only look at the winners and think that not a lot of work went into them. But like UI design is not something you save for like the very end. And I think again goes back to this major point that we've talked about before, that the games that do succeed the best are the ones that do all the right stuff. You know, they do proper playtesting, they figure out their core gameplay loop early. And the titles that we see kind of slide by on those aspects tend to become either niche successes, there we go, or they just fall by the wayside. And for a lot of developers, they don't seem to understand, you know, when their game fails like that. Like, you know, why didn't my game do good or do all that? When you look at it, and it's just like this mess of UI elements, or the game just doesn't play right. And then the cynical question is, you know, how could it even do well with these issues?
Yeah, it's a big question as to how that works, and you can't depend on fixing it after, like fix it in post, as they would say in the movies. It's just not. It's not doable, and if you're looking to make money, that is not the way to make money in the games business.
Or even just thrive or survive in it.
Yeah. I'm with you, Mike. I've done enough unprofessional things. I think I'm done with it. Release it correctly, or don't do it at all.
Yep. So we'll begin to wrap things up. I'm starting to get tired. I think you are as well, Rob. The audience loves it when we get tired, because that's when we start making mistakes and stuff. But like when it comes, like here's my final thought on the topic. Good UI design is not a magical thing, and it's not something you can hold over the player's head saying, well, we did our very best and this is what we had. No, UI design is up there in terms of things that you must do right. And as you said earlier, Rob, that everything, like there are so many games being released these days that you can't, like for instance, you can't release a platformer with bad UI. There are far too many platformers out there to say that, oh, there's no reference. It's kind of like, I think the analogy would be, it's kind of like somebody who wanting to build, let's say a craftsman wanting to build like a wooden desk, or somebody doing metalworking. There are enough examples out there, there's enough books and lessons out there that you can use that to improve your thing, or to improve your craft. And that's, at the end of the day, game design is still a craft as much of it is an art and a science, or how many other descriptors we want to use. And you can't just use, you know, blissful or willing ignorance to excuse a bad UI. And especially not today. Like, again, if I'm not going to sit through your game to play through or to find the good stuff, what makes you think a consumer who's being bombarded with games is going to do that? And like one other example would be stuff like Solak Entertainment. We've talked about them many times before with Drox Operative. They're working on a Zombicide, I think, right now. Or, no, not Zombicide. They're working on another game whose name escapes me at the moment. And his games are some of the most expansive and innovative in terms of ARPG design, but they are horrible when it comes to UI. And I can't give that developer any more slack when it comes to that. Because I may enjoy his games to some extent, but if given the choice between playing a Solak Entertainment game, or even something from like Grim Dawn or Path of Exile, I'm going to play those games that are more enjoyable to get into, rather than suffering through an UI for 5 to 10 hours.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And here's my final point then. what I just said, 5 to 10 hours, bad UI doesn't go away. It just becomes something that we bear. But if a game, like I say, if a game has bad UI minute 1, it's still going to be there at hour 100, or however far someone's going to play. And while some people are going to look past that, the vast majority are not. And you cannot put aside UI design. Now, there are little things, again, we all have those little, things we would like to have when it comes to UI design that can help a game. But if people are complaining about your UI within 2 minutes of playing your game, all those elements have to be fixed. Like, there should not be any issues within the first 10 to 15 minutes of play. Because, again, it goes back to that analogy of, it's like designing a car with the steering wheel in the wrong spot. Like, you're going to notice that the second you get into the car. It's never going to get better. And that's just, step 1, minute 1 kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I'll turn over to you, Rob. Do you have any final thoughts on UI design?
No. Again, I think we've discussed most of it. I guess my final thought is just to agree. It's you gotta have it there to at least be manageable and navigable. And if it means your game looks the same, your UI looks the same as someone else's, hey, if it works, it works. Go with it. Make sure it works. Yep. The worst thing you can do is non-functional UI or really hard to understand UI. Not everything you do in a game has to be uber unique. Sometimes familiar can be better sometimes. Yeah.
And this is why we still bring up Nintendo and Blizzard as well. Blizzard is one of the best companies at refining and polishing an idea. And again, like, they know what works when it comes to their designs. They know how to make a UI that's appealing. Again, so many people have played Hearthstone and Overwatch and etc., etc. Like, they know how to make... Everybody likes your shirt, Rob.
Nice.
There we go. I've been told I look like Steve from Blue's Clues because I'm wearing like a blue striped shirt here. But, again, good UI design is not a lost art that you must, go to the Himalayan mountains to discover. Many people are making video games these days. And if you see a trend when it comes to UI design, don't ignore that trend. Again, if with so many platforms being released, don't make a triangle or a Y on the Xbox controller be your jump button. We all have gotten used to A. A has been, it's hard to see there. It's kind of faded from wearing it for so long. But so many UI elements have become standardized over the last decade that you can't ignore that, either willingly or by just not doing your research. And again, for many independent developers who think like they're trying to be, this auteur who's going to revolutionize UI design, pretty much 10 out of 10 times you're not going to do that. And if a UI is not functional, it's not easy to get into, everything else just, falls out of play there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I can think of one example in my history that it worked. And it was a long time ago in the 90s. So 3D Studio Max was the big animation program, and I'm trying to remember the one that replaced it. Maya. Maya had ridiculously different interface. Like, it was way different from anything anyone had used before, at least for the most part. And they managed to turn the graphics, creation industry, the 3D graphics, on its ear with their UI, and yet somehow it worked.
You kind of just popped there, Rob, when you said that.
I'm sorry. I
think that just scared everybody there.
So yeah, it was just really, it was so different. Like, I can't, when I tried Maya for the first time and I was used to 3D Studio Max, like, that difference was so huge, and it actually made me not want to do Maya anymore. But I know Maya had so many other things going for it. But that was one of those examples of it somehow working and somehow changing the industry a little bit. That, sometimes it happens, but it's not going to for you. Just assume it's not going to happen for you. They were lucky, and they could have shot themselves in the foot right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. And Mike wants to ask you very quickly, what do you think of Blender?
Oh gosh, it's been so long. Like seriously, I haven't been in 3D modeling or animation since Blender might have come out. I don't know much about it except that it's relatively easy to get into and fairly inexpensive to get into. So, good for them. But that's all I know of it. It's been forever.
Mm-hmm. But I think with that, we will wrap things up for this week before we have any more jump scares to give to the audience there. Between my sneezing, Rob there, we're just going, this has been a very weird end of the year cast. But I'd like to thank everybody for coming out, whether you are new or returning. Be sure to check the new Magnum PI. There we go. All right. There, we could do our own detective show. Oh, a detective choose your own adventure video game, Rob. Pitch that
there you go.
Pitch that one to 2K. Or, yeah, pitch it to Netflix, too. But we're going to wrap things up for this week. Rob, it was great having you on. Have a great new year, and, of course, the rest of the holiday as well.
Yeah, same to you. Same to everybody in chat. Always.
Oh, you
Sorry,
you cut out there. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to say Happy New Year's to everybody. It's always been it's always a great pleasure to be on. And yeah, Happy New Year. We'll hopefully keep this going through 2K19.
All right. And for the folks watching this live right now, I'll be doing another little live show Monday night, kind of as our Game Wisdom wrap-up party for 2018. So be sure to check that one out. And if you're watching this record and would like to see the whole show with all the sneezing and weird takes uncut, check out patreon.com/GWBycer.